Okay. Okay, thanks. Sorry that you're in this terrible spot. Um, Thank you for being here. I'm really excited to have over 100 people from local Catholic colleges and universities represented here. Thank you for being here, for having the worst job of the day. Today's talk, I want to start with my background. I feel like I don't know many of you, and it would be good for you to have a sense of who I am before I jump into arguing why I think fair trade should matter to us. I'll give a little background on the origins of fair trade. Since you're here, I assume that you know basic ideas about what fair trade means, but I'll keep that fairly short. And then I'll go into the research on fair trade today in academia, and then talk about why both fair trade, why we should care about this issue and what we can do today. Thank you. Okay, two more. Thanks. So my research is on the fair trade movement. I look at the consumer side of fair trade. So what does it mean to be an ethical consumer? So I use the fair trade movement as kind of a case study to look at broader questions about how do we manage contradictions between our everyday purchases and our views of ourselves. I came into this project while in graduate school. I'm a pretty critical person. Nobody's ever accused me of being very optimistic. So I'm sitting in graduate school classes, and we're deconstructing race, deconstructing gender, and we're saying what's wrong with everything and everyone, and it's kind of who I am, and I'm kind of good at it, but it's also kind of a downer and frustrating. So in one of these classes, we went to a fair trade coffee shop. This is about 12 years ago. And I knew nothing about fair trade, but I was struck by the optimism and the feelings of change that could occur through an everyday purchase. So I began looking into fair trade a little bit more, and a few years later started a dissertation, which later turned into a book, which is out in about a week. Jackie DiCarlo from CRS doesn't believe me that it's ever coming out, but it is coming out. So in this talk, I'm applying my academic background and this kind of critical orientation to fair trade. So I'm not up here as an activist, although on some level I am, right? Because I do believe that fair trade is a better way to consume, as I'll talk about here. But at the same time, I'm going to talk critically about fair trade so that you have some basic knowledge for talking points when people say what's right or what's wrong with fair trade. Thanks. Okay, so the origins of fair trade are very diverse. So some of you know a little bit about fair trade, and if you pick up one book, the origins of fair trade may start in Europe. In another book, they're going to start with Edna Ruth Byler, a member of the Mennonite Church in the United States. This is true, right? And this is the origins of this movement are diverse, and as such, there's sometimes conflict and divergence within this movement. So in around 1946, Edna Ruth Byler was a member of the Mennonite Church, and she saw the poor living conditions of artisans in Puerto Rico, and she began buying their products, bringing them back to her congregation, and selling them. The market that she created started to grow very slowly, but steadily. And soon the Mennonite Central Committee took over that organization, and many years later that organization turned into 10,000 Villages, which is the largest buyer of fair trade handicrafts in the world. Around the same time in Europe, you had alternative trade organizations that were looking to sell objects, oftentimes handicrafts, to help development in war-torn countries throughout Europe. Both of these divergent kind of happenings eventually coalesced into a movement that we now call fair trade. Throughout the 60s, yes, you can go, Dan. Thanks. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, this growth of kind of handicrafts and artisanal goods that were sold for a cause slowly continued to grow, but the fair trade movement changed forever in the mid 80s with the importation of something called solidarity coffee. So solidarity coffee, a number of ethical entrepreneurs, Equal Exchange being one, began importing coffee from Nicaragua because there was a boycott against the country at the time. So they wanted to express solidarity with Sandinista farmers who couldn't sell their goods and were really suffering from this boycott. Remember, this is the Cold War, so one of the reasons this boycott's in place is because of the fear of the spread of communism. And this boycott had a tremendously detrimental effect on coffee farmers. So these entrepreneurs, right, and this is inspirational to me at least, they figured, how do we get around this boycott? They shipped the coffee to Holland and the Netherlands and roasted it there, and then were able to import it back to the United States because they significantly altered the product itself, which allowed it to get around that loophole. So you could imagine this was not a very profitable endeavor, right? I mean, if you're roasting your coffee in Europe and then shipping it back to the United States, incredibly expensive. But nevertheless, it set the groundwork for Solidarity Coffee, for mission-driven attempts to kind of change the world through our everyday purchases. Around the same time, the late 80s, early 90s, you had independent labeling organizations like Fair Trade USA, today used to be Transfair. Each country began setting up initiatives to establish what fair trade meant, or what socially responsible importation of these goods meant. And as we got different labeling organizations in different countries, there was a lot of confusion over what this idea of fair trade meant. So an umbrella organization in the late 90s called FLOW was set up to kind of coordinate those criterias for what fair trade means. Thank you. Okay, so here we are today. And those of you who know deeply about fair trade are aware that there's tensions between, is fair trade a social movement, is it a market? The truth is it's both, right? And all markets, all movements that are promoting change within markets face tensions, right? People who cared about organics were very upset when the standards for organics were set in this country because they argued that the standards were too low. Most recently in fair trade, we have Fair Trade USA's campaign, which has changed the standards for what fair trade means. And we get a split in the movement. We get a group of people who want to see more change happening, as much money as possible going to individual farmers. And then we get another wing of the movement who say the only way... Oh, nice. Oh, you got to be elated. All right, thanks, Dan. You get another wing of the movement that says total sales is what can help farmers the most, and we don't care where our coffee is being sold as long as we're selling as much fair trade coffee as possible. I want to give a story about this kind of tension that played out it's about 6 years ago at Joe Chase's coffee shop. Joe's sitting in the back of the room, and he opened the first fair trade coffee shop in Philadelphia. And it's about 6 years ago, Fair Trade USA, at the time Transfair, brought in a coffee farmer from Peru named Cesar Rivas. And Cesar had traveled all around the Northeast. Maybe he was at some of your colleges, maybe even that day. He arrived at Joe's coffee shop at about 7:30 at night and had already given 2 presentations that day. He looked exhausted. Joe had about 30 people in his shop ready to greet Cesar. And he showed up with nice khaki pants, very nice shoes. He didn't look at all like the farmers we see in the advertisements. You know, the smiling coffee farmer who's so grateful for your purchase, right? He didn't look, he looked well-dressed. He looked educated. He was educated. And what I knew and other people knew in the room, some people, was that oftentimes the farmers who get sent over to the United States are often the most educated, well-off members of their cooperatives. But I couldn't help thinking if Cesar had like, a mule, with him, like he would be viewed as more authentic and people would really like listen to what he had to say a little bit more. But he was riveting. The whole room was listening to Cesar talk about how fair trade helped change his life. And the interesting part came at the Q&A. So a young man raised his hand and said, I really want to support fair trade at shops like Joe's Coffee House in Philadelphia. He said, but I don't want to support fair trade at places like Starbucks. Starbucks is a big corporation that's just profit-driven, and it's not me. He said while he worked at a chain store, which he revealed was okay because it was Trader Joe's, so everybody, they get a free pass, a free morality pass, I think. So he says this question, and David Funkhauser, who's in PR and many of you in the room know from Transfer, smiled because David has seen this question time and time again. So David responds and says, interprets it to Cesar, and Cesar's response was, we sell a lot of our coffee to small, independent, fair trade shops like Joe. And then he said, but our biggest buyer is Starbucks. The whole room got deflated. Everybody in the room just was like, no. Now the context is, at Joe's shop, Starbucks had just been trying to hand out free coffee cards to Joe's own customers, like while they were sitting outside his shop. Starbucks at the time was selling about 5 to 8% fair trade coffee, but some of their advertisements kind of hinted that all their coffee was fair trade. So there was a lot of frustration among the mission or the movement wing of fair trade at Starbucks, right? So in my head, I'm thinking this is a turning point. These people are going to say, Cesar's really benefiting greatly from Starbucks, right, from this sale, right? Even though these social movement activists were against this marketing wing of fair trade, they had to be convinced that Cesar is telling them this is beneficial to him. So a few days later, I interviewed some of the people who were at that talk, and they told me it was just a form of propaganda. They were like, how could they do that? How could they sell Starbucks at Joe's coffee shop? Like, I don't buy it. I don't believe in it. What I'm getting at in this tension, right, in this moment is you get this tension between a movement and a market wing of fair trade, and it's intense. It's ideological. Sometimes we can't look past these divides that we've created. If we view fair trade as a movement, not a market, I think we can get past a lot of these hurdles into what fair trade means. And at the same time, I think we should be asking questions about the changes to Fair Trade USA, right? I think we should be asking, is this beneficial for coffee farmers? And I think Fair Trade USA should be receptive to those kinds of questions. I want to highlight some of the research that's on fair trade. Up here you'll see Jackie's book, which is a beginner's guide to fair trade. If I don't put Jackie's book up in every presentation I give, she sends me hate messages. So I make sure, she's at CRS and she looks all nice, but she's not. She's nasty and ruthless. So I always plug her work. It's a great book. It's used in a lot of college courses. Some of you know Dean's Beans, and some of you know this book. This is another very popular, accessible book about his travels around looking for high-quality, socially responsible coffee. There's a lot of research right now on what's happening on the ground in fair trade communities. Fair trade coffee growing and communities where artisans are producing goods for organizations like 10,000 Villages. At the same time, it's very difficult to do this research. And I think you have to be very skeptical of some of this research. This is research I really think is high quality. Because, all right, imagine you want to study a community and see, all right, how are fair trade premiums helping farmers in this community, for instance? You do 2 years' worth of field work. You're an anthropologist or an ethnographer. Well, how do you know those changes aren't the result of changes in the price of coffee overall? How do you know the changes that you're seeing aren't the result of other factors related to globalization, to climate change, or any other variables that could be impacting what you see? In other words, what I'm getting at is it's very hard to compare communities that are selling fair trade products with communities that are not selling fair trade products. So by reading one or two books, you do get a good story to tell, but how objective of it, it's very difficult to make these kind of observations. So you kind of got to look across this research to make these conclusions. I'm going to try and sum up some of the major benefits that we are seeing across this research. Somebody, I don't know who did this. Somebody must have put my book up there. This is new to me, so selling books and promoting books is totally awkward and uncomfortable. But I guess it's what I have to do. So the research that I'm doing is, again, looking at the consumer side of this movement. I'm looking at people who hung out at Joe's coffee shop or who went to an off-site sale at Chestnut Hill College to promote for Poverty Awareness Week or a fair trade event. In doing this research, I visited St. Joe's, Chestnut Hill College. At the time, St. Joe's had this really progressive fair trade campaign going on that stalled for a while and is finally being reinvigorated, largely because of many of the students who are here today. There's also children's books on fair trade, and this Cafecito story is great. I mean, I know the students here, most of you don't have children, but these are great little different avenues to look at an idea such as fair trade. Research on, if you want to find out these books, if you're looking to gather information about what this means for your local campuses, the Fair Trade Resource Network is an unbelievable resource. It has a database of almost every fair trade article that's out there, and it also profiles a number of books that are well received. Okay, so what does fair trade, how does it benefit producers? There is reliable data showing that fair trade farmers receive small but real economic benefits from selling fair trade coffee. I'm going to stick with coffee with this slide here. This research shows that families are able to provide better health care for their farmers are able to provide better health care for their whole families, and children are able to stay in school longer because of their relationship to fair trade. This is significant. I mean, the whole education system in a lot of these communities is built around coffee harvesting season, when children get weeks off at a time so they can help their families pick coffee. So keeping children in school longer allows a lot of potential benefits. Even if they stay on their coffee farms, it allows them to get better understanding of market access, how to market their coffee and find a better buyer. There's consistently, we're seeing research that even non-fair trade relationships are benefiting from nearby families that are selling fair trade products. So for instance, if a small cooperative has a fair trade relationship, the economic premiums that they're receiving allow them to consistently hire people to help pick their coffee, right? And that provides stable, reliable, consistent jobs year after year. I'm sure everybody in this room has been asked what fair trade means, and I also am sure that you've given different answers almost every time. Sometimes, to pick on Joe again, Joe used to say, he used to emphasize the coffee quality, and I'm sure he still does, and used to talk about different benefits for farmers, including that their children didn't have to pick coffee, right? Which was sometimes true and sometimes not, but it wasn't, in fair trade relationships, children aren't forced out into the coffee fields like they might be in poorly sourced chocolate, for instance. There's a number of benefits of fair trade that are difficult to explain to other people, but if you talk to fair trade producers, they'll often say, this is what's most beneficial. They'll often say, yes, I get an economic premium that is important to me and my family, but I also get, and you hear this quite a lot, is improved knowledge about how to sell my products, right? It's with globalization, with the internet, with you can gain access to markets in a way that you couldn't 10 years ago, that you definitely couldn't 20 years ago. It's cheaper to ship products around the world. It's easier to find a buyer than ever before. The problem is a lot of artisans and a lot of farmers don't exactly know what buyers are demanding, right? And fair trade relationships, right, help educate farmers and educate artisans as to what Western consumers are demanding, right? So in the coffee market, we're seeing this rise of really high-end, pricey, expensive coffees, just like the wine market went through, many years ago, just like we're seeing with craft beers now, right? You're seeing these really independently owned, small batch, high-end beers. It's the same thing with coffee, and this has been going on for 30-plus years. Fair trade, for some people, it allows them to first create a relationship with a buyer and then realize how to grow better and better coffee, and then maybe even stop selling fair trade because you developed a direct trade relationship with a buyer. It's not always better to move out of the fair trade system, but at least it gives farmers this option. And then reduced use of pesticides and shade-grown trees, shade-grown farms. These are significant benefits for the environment that you're seeing through fair trade. Okay, critiques of fair trade. They're out there. We should be able to deal with them and see which of these critiques has some merit and where some change maybe should occur. Economists often critique fair trade because they say that the coffee problems, right? Again, I know I'm centralizing probably a little too much on coffee. We can talk more about other fair trade products throughout the conference. With coffee, about every 10 to 12 years, you're seeing this boom-bust cycle. So the price of coffee goes up, and then it plummets and drops sharply, where in 2000, 2001, the price of coffee was about 40 cents a pound. To give you an idea of how low that is, it was costing more to grow the coffee than farmers were able to get on the market. So in Central America, this led to widespread deaths, malnutrition, migrations. Tens of thousands of people were moving from rural to urban areas because they didn't have work. They couldn't put food on their families' plates. So economists will say fair trade is bad because some economists say that fair trade is bad because it creates an incentive for people to keep growing coffee when in reality they should get out of the coffee market altogether, right? The critique is fair, right? There is a truth to this critique. At the same time, the critique is, I want to lessen the critique. I want to say that this is a reality and this is something that we should be aware of. At the same time, if you look what's going on in coffee growing communities, the fair trade activists, the fair trade importers all know this, right? And the farmers know this. And they've been told to diversify their crops for at least 10 years, and this is what's happening, right? Fair trade premiums are allowing some families to get their kids into schools and get jobs off their farms, which not everybody wants. Many families want to keep their children on their farms and keep their land. But it gives them the option to get away from farming. So what I'm arguing is, even though this critique has some merit, if you look at what's happening in practice, you're seeing that a lot of fair trade activists and fair trade farmers are diversifying their crops so that they don't get into this oversupply problem, right, to deal with this coffee crisis. You get another critique coming from cultural studies, and you get it from some anthropologists, and they say that fair trade is a form of eco-colonialism. So you get this idea that we're consuming this other, right? These smiling, far-off, exotic farmers, right? You get this critique that fair trade was designed to eliminate a middleman, right? So if you look at the steps involved in just coffee, right? It's incredibly labor-intensive. You've got to plant the coffee, you've got to maintain it, you've got to pick it, You've got to depulp it. You've got to dry it. You've got to ship it so that it goes through a dry mill, which has another 12 stages where the coffee is processed. You've got to export it. You've got to import it. You've got to get it to a coffee shop. Each of those steps takes a little bit of money away from money that the farmers would receive. So fair trade, one of fair trade's goals is to break down those steps, assuring that farmers get more money back. That's happened, right? This is exciting, and it's happened. But some are critiquing fair trade and saying, well, the exploitative middlemen are being replaced by the do-gooder middlemen. So the new bureaucracy that's in place is these independent labeling organizations that have to certify what fair trade means, and they receive a little bit of that money. It's true, right? This has happened, right? At the same time, most of these independent labeling organizations are designed to grow the coffee market and to provide trust for consumers that fair trade standards are being met. So, I mean, whereas this is something we should be skeptical of and worried about to a degree, at the same time, these standards are in place for a reason. You see this with, so banana farmers often have to change their, the pesticides that they use to grow their bananas. And sometimes the farmers have no idea why these standards are put in place, right? That they're being told to eliminate pesticides that are incredibly effective. And for them, it's incredibly frustrating. Like, why am I having to change my standards that are working? Many in the fair trade movement are hearing this critique, and hopefully this information is starting to trickle down so farmers understand why these changes are being made. And then another critique is that fair trade simply can't eliminate poverty, or you know, this critique gets framed in different ways. Fair trade is not going to change people's lives radically. And the truth is it's not, right? But many people don't want their lives changed radically. They just want a little more security. They want loans that aren't at 30% interest rates, right? They want contracts with buyers that last 5 or 6 years so that they can plan a future for their families. So fair trade, you know, in agricultural communities or underdeveloped communities where people in Bangladesh are producing baskets for 10,000 villages, right? It provides more security for families, and we are seeing real, tangible benefits for farmers. Okay, international travel. Looking across this research, I'm personally left with the feeling that fair trade's a better way to consume, right? It's not going to solve all these world's problems, right? But it does start to chip away at them, and it does kind of act as a Trojan horse in our minds, in the sense that if we start thinking about where our coffee is coming from or the gifts we give from 10,000 villages are coming from, it makes us think more deeply about our engagement with other purchases that we make. For me, and for in my research, I found that international travel is a major tipping point for many in the fair trade movement. So when I talk to fair trade entrepreneurs, coffee shop owners, people working at 10,000 villages, national leaders of the fair trade movement, almost all of them had some kind of profound international travel experience where they said, my life changed, my eyes opened up, I converted, right? Many of you in this, I can see because some of you are starting to pay attention again. So what that means is, like, you guys are the type of people who went on these types of trips, right? And your eyes change, or you're planning to go on one of these types of trips, and it makes you see the world a little bit differently. For me, in 2005, I woke up in a shed in northern Nicaragua. The floors were dirt and wet because it was the end of rainy season. The walls were dilapidated and somewhat transparent. A bat flew. It took me half the day to figure out what the sound was from the night before, but it was a bat flying in and out of my room. We slept under mosquito nets to protect us from dengue fever and malaria, whereas our host families who held us on this trip didn't have these same mosquito nets, these same protections. A number of the students from St. Joe's who are here were on that trip, and I had to admit quite a bit of terror after our first night in the campo when some of them were absolutely were up all night because of cockroaches that were huge and bugs that they've never seen before. I don't think they've still forgiven me. But after a day in that same community, I didn't hear another complaint, right? Because I think they had such a wonderful experience seeing what everyday life was like in the campo, in this community, that at least I was freed from their harsh critiques. I mention these stories because that's what they are, right? When we go on these types of trips, we don't come back and say, this isn't like, I followed people after they went on these types of trips and interviewed them for months later, and they didn't come back and say, you know what, you need to buy fair trade because the price is $1.21 a pound on the C price, the free market price, and it needs to be $1.35 a pound. And I talked to a farmer, and he told me, nobody's doing that, right? People didn't come back with like really specific information about fair trade. What they came back with was stories. They came back with stories about eating dinner with a family, playing games of Go Fish with the children, playing baseball in a dense jungle, right? Sometimes exoticizing in the way I was there, which is really uncomfortable, right? The experience, like, you know, I don't even pronounce Nicaragua correctly, right? So I'm not somebody who should be talking about the history of that community. But at the same time, I learned enough, and people who go on these trips, they learn enough to support this type of movement and this type of cause. When I left Nicaragua for the first time in 2005, I was on a flight home, and the woman sitting next to me starts talking about, she's about 24 years old, and she starts talking about coffee, and I was shocked. You know, I didn't know that at the time it was ignorance, because every time you leave Nicaragua, half the flight has some relationship to coffee. So it was somewhat ignorant, but I didn't know. Harriet starts telling her story about fair trade, and she had lived with a family that was growing coffee during this coffee crisis in 2001. And Harriet's story goes like this. I asked Harriet, how do you tell people about what you saw? When you returned to the U.S., you know, you've been living there for 2 years. How do you tell people the levels of poverty that you're seeing on an everyday basis? And she said, I do it through stories. And her story was that she lived with a family and the youngest child died from malnutrition and eventually starvation due to the coffee crisis. Again, when the price of coffee got to 40 cents a pound in 2001. So this youngest child died. She's preparing for the funeral, and she's devastated, right? I mean, she's living in this house with this child. And she said, as upset as I was, nothing prepared me for the morning of the funeral when the older brother came into the room that I was staying, and he said, I get him, jokingly, she said, I guess this just means there's more food for the rest of us, right? This dark, harrowing story that is a way to get at what fair trade means. And I think that's how fair trade becomes infectious and viral. Not these dark, harrowing stories, but these positive, uplifting stories of solidarity, of staying with a family where, they call you the as one of our students gets called, the Queen of England when she stays there because, she's a princess, right? She's an American princess compared to the coffee farmers there. And this student is hiding. These stories are what inspire us to become part of this fair trade movement, right? I mean, this is the potential for fair trade. So why should we support fair trade? The crux of this talk. Your campus wants it, right? I mean, if you look at survey research on American consumers, you'll see a growing number of consumers are looking for fair trade products, and B, there is research out there showing that not just are they looking for it, but that they're willing to pay a price premium for it. So, I'm a little skeptical of the research that just says, oh yeah, I'm willing to pay extra for fair trade. What I'm calling out is research that used experimental designs and raised the price of sweatshop-free socks over months at a time, and showed that people were really willing to pay an extra amount of money when they knew the money was going to a cause they supported. not only do students at our campuses want this, potential students want it, right? If you look at the demographics of who knows about fair trade, it's more, younger people are much more likely to know about fair trade than older people, right? So high school students know about this issue. They want it. And if you look at the tours on your campuses, they always go to the dining services. They always go to the cafeteria. And people who lead these tours say they're always asked about sustainability issues with food, right? So fair trade can become a selling point for our universities. Price differences are often negligible, right? As soon as you start talking about pushing fair trade, you hear pushback about it just costs more. And sometimes it does. And sometimes it doesn't, right? I encourage us all, and myself included, to ask questions of some of the campuses that have, Villanova has a very sustained push for a fair trade status, as does Cabrini. And let's look at the resistance they faced as they tried to make this transition. And let's look at how they navigated this price difference. And from my early conversations with some of the people doing this movement is they found suppliers that had very minimal, if any, price differences. And I think that's something we should be aware of. This isn't a problem. This is something that's easily we can overcome. Okay. This is an argument that you would hear more 10 years ago, that fair trade, the taste of fair trade is no good, and that we need, that fair trade doesn't taste as good as other coffees, and it's simply not true, right? There's no merit to this argument whatsoever. There is merit to the argument that if you support fair trade, you're more likely to argue, oh, fair trade just tastes better, right? And if you hate fair trade, you're more likely to say, if politically or ideologically you don't agree with it, you're more likely to say it doesn't taste as good. Let me give you an example. So I was interviewing a woman about her fair trade purchases in her Chestnut Hill home in Philadelphia, and as we're doing this interview, her dog is like chirping, just barking and jumping all over my leg. And the woman laughed and she said, oh, you know, actually this is the biggest consumer of organics in our house. Like, my dog eats organic dog food and prefers it over any other dog food, right? Let's think critically about this, right? Is her dog, like, you know, sampling all the dog foods that are out there and consistently going to organic, right? Obviously not. The point being, you know, she politically identifies with fair trade and organic and certain types of food as something she really supports. And then her argument about the taste aligns with her political identity. And you see this all the time. So another example showing that fair trade certification doesn't impact taste. A lot of coffee that's sold without fair trade is produced with fair trade standards. So in other words, there's not enough demand to buy up all the fair trade coffee beans that are produced. So a lot of conventionally sold coffee is produced with fair trade standards. So again, it's another example of there's no alignment at all with taste and fair trade. There is good coffee out there. There's bad coffee out there. There's good tea. There's bad tea, right? This is something you've got to find in your search at your university. Another reason we should do this is because Villanova's doing it, all right? And if Villanova's doing it, that means we need to do it. I say this facetiously, but in reality, I mean it. I really do mean this, right? I don't mean Villanova. I mean all of a sudden Newman's here, right? And St. Joe's is doing this, and Chestnut Hill is doing this, right? And if they're doing this, you know, talk to senior administrators. You know, the faculty who are here know this, but and administrators know this. They're constantly looking at their peers to see what they're doing and what's selling and what's working. Right? We're constantly looking at other advertising campaigns because as much as we sometimes don't like to think this way, this school, we're in competition with each other and drawing in new students, right? So if other local Catholic colleges are making this decision, there's some kind of institutional pressure to do it yourself. You also see this same kind of thing. I know at St. Joe's we look at local Catholic colleges, and we also look nationally at what other Jesuit colleges are doing. To see what kind of campaigns they're putting forth. It's another way of kind of peer pressure into adopting either simply more fair trade products or adopting a fair trade campaign. Okay, why else should we support fair trade? It aligns with the principles of Catholic social teaching. I'm not, I was raised, my dad's Catholic, my mom's Lutheran, so I am not going to be the person to stand up here and tell everybody how Catholic social teaching means you need to purchase products this way. Now, having said that, the last time my students and I went to Nicaragua was in May, and in my class, I had told them all about the statistics about Nicaragua. It's the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to one of the poorest regions within that country, and all these kind of harrowing statistics. What I loved is that once we got there, our vendor, our tour guide, I didn't know how great they were going to be, and he said, you've probably heard all these statistics, and they're true. And then he said, but that's not what you should be looking at. That's not what you should be caring about. What you should be caring about is your everyday interactions and the joy and the happiness you're seeing with people that you meet on this trip, right? It's the solidarity. It's not we're not helping other people, right? I mean, I asked, what can we do to help? And then I realized how arrogant that question was, right? Because the question, we're not lifting other people out of poverty, right? But it is fair trade. There is an economic premium going to farmers and producers, but there's also a sense of social solidarity that's created, right? And maybe this is what's most meaningful in fair trade relationships. And this is what aligns with Catholic social teaching. One final point. I don't think as individuals, here's the cynical part, right? I don't think we can make a difference, right? After interviewing consumers who care deeply about these types of products, sustainable this, sustainable that, socially responsible this and that, right? I constantly found people saying things like, and this isn't the diehard fair traders, but the majority of people that I met were like, I hate Walmart. Walmart is so gross. But last week when I had to go to Walmart, I picked up X, Y, and Z, right? I don't think we as individuals, I think we're used to contradicting our own value system, right? It's something we do we make so many purchases on a daily basis in this consumer society that how could we research and know the labor conditions of who made our toothbrush, right? Who made the tires on our car, the doors in our homes. Right? It's problematic, right? And it could lead to paralysis. Nevertheless, I think we can make a difference. If I'm looking at who makes a difference in the fair trade movement, it's not so much consumers. It is a lot fair trade retailers. A coffee entrepreneur who decided to sell fair trade coffee. People working at NGOs who are looking at developmental programs to help provide better taste, better high quality teas and coffees and bananas, right? These are the change agents in the movement. And we are the change agents as well, right? Getting our universities to adopt a fair trade coffee just as a start, right? Many of you already have this. This is a big, significant change, right? That affects many, many families, right? Joe's coffee shop, his supplier, Equal Exchange, would tell him how many coffee families were impacted through selling Equal Exchange coffee. Right? That pushback, that feedback was really meaningful for Joe and other coffee entrepreneurs in the city because it says, look, I'm helping 300 people this past year. If our institutions adopt this change, this is a radical change that really can make a difference. Okay. Moving forward with our consortium, the last set of slides that I want to highlight here are how I want us to start thinking about, we're here. What can we do? What's the next step? In making these decisions, in brainstorming today, I want you to think about a couple findings from social movement research that show what encourages people to participate in social movements. And one of the findings is if we believe once we participate, other people will too, we become more likely to participate in a movement, right? So I fall into the trap, and some of my students fall into this trap as well, where we get frustrated when somebody agreed to help us with a fair trade campaign and then they drop out at the last minute, right? And some of you probably had colleagues here who were supposed to come and, at the last minute they didn't. This happens, and it is frustrating, and I get frustrated. But at the same time, if we look around, the work that you're putting in is happening at other schools, right? And one of the goals of this consortium is to make connections across our universities so that we hold ourselves accountable. We see that if we're making changes at Chestnut Hill, St. Joe's is going to push as well, right? And together, there's some kind of collective sense of accomplishment that we can achieve. So what I'm asking here is to start brainstorming. The last session of the day that Dr. John Burke is going to lead is a roadmap, a way forward. And throughout the conversations today, I'm hoping you can think of different platforms, right? We're all bringing a lot to the table, different assets to this table. How can we move forward? How can we hold each other accountable? Personally, I'm thinking of St. Joe's participates in Recycle Mania. Does other schools participate in this? No? Okay. Maybe that's why we win it a lot, because there's not a lot of schools in it. In the Atlantic 10, I think all the Atlantic 10 schools participate in Recycle Mania. And what it does is it tracks the amount that each school recycles and relays that information into a competition against other schools. And it's within the Atlantic 10, but it's also a national program, too. Now, one reason this is an exciting campaign is because you're held in check with how much you're improving your recycling rates versus before this competition started. And it's a good way to say, all right, I'm committing to recycling. Students are dumpster diving to count, how much stuff is not being recycled. It's a pretty cool, not cool for me, but I guess students who are into dumpster diving love it. It's a cool campaign because it holds people in check. Okay, a second finding as to what encourages people to participate in social movements is that if we believe our efforts are efficiently going to the cause we support, we are more likely to support that cause. At St. Joe's, we just got these water bottle dispensers. So you put at the water fountain, there's now a spot to fill up your water bottle, right? It's a small step. The goal being reducing the amount of bottled water consumed on campus. What students keep saying they liking, and I do too, is each time you put your water bottle in, there's a clicker, right? And it says, all right, another bottle of water saved. And, so every time you're putting that in, you're seeing the collective change that has occurred from people doing a simple everyday act, right? And I think that's something we need to think about in our campaign moving forward. How do we show that our efforts are efficiently going to a cause? Maybe it's collectively adopting a fair trade community, right? A fair trade set of farms. Maybe it's increasing the number of study tours to go visit farms all over the world. Whatever it is, I think we need to think, if we want us to continue in this push, we need some kind of feedback into how our efforts are efficiently going to the causes we support. This is a 10-year-old campaign from MIT at the bottom, where professors played off that old Got Milk campaign, and it was like, Got Fair Trade. The reason I put this up here is, this is creative, different campaigns going out there, and hopefully, what we're doing today is setting the groundwork for a next local movement. I don't know which direction we're headed, right? But you guys are all here for some reason or another. Hopefully it's not class credit, but maybe that's sufficient. You're here, right? So you guys are the people, we are the people who can make this change, and hopefully today sets the groundwork for that change happening. So thank you. Do we want any questions before we move on to? Sure. So I was supposed to do that earlier, and I breezed through it. So I interviewed, partly with the help of Jackie and a number of other leaders of the fair trade movement, about 25 national leaders of fair trade. So these are people who started major companies, are heading major organizations, and we looked at their pathways into how they got into the fair trade movement. The bulk of my research was here in Philadelphia, and I hung out with a collection of fair trade coffee shops. The Green Line in West Philadelphia, Mugshots in Fairmount, Joe Coffee House, which was at 11th and Walnut, and Infusion, which is in Mount Airy. And they were a cooperative of fair trade shops, so I hung out with them to look at what their marketing strategies were, how they were trying to find a niche in the coffee world. And I volunteered at a 10,000 Villages for 2 years, and I would interview customers. Amazingly, they agreed to sit down at interviews, with some stranger approaching them. And what I was trying to see, some of the things that I found was that people often will willfully ignore their ideals when they're making purchases. So if they think that they're going to buy a coffee that's not fair trade or what they view as socially responsible, they'll just not ask any questions about where the coffee came from. There is a gamesmanship, a status making within fair trade, like how do I appear socially responsible? At the same time, I guess one of the more interesting things is that people don't want to appear too preachy. Like, this was a major tension. I was really shocked at this. So you walk into 10,000 Villages, and there's signs like, with this purchase, we'll provide 2 more tortillas for our family, and it would have the person's name under it, right? Really powerful kind of slogans. And those of you who shop there, when you make a purchase, you get that little narrative that comes with the gift that says this was hand-woven in Bangladesh, and this family, X, Y, and Z. But what I found is in interactions with workers and customers, even though they're trained to talk about why you should buy this coffee, they rarely deployed those moral imperatives. Instead, they said things like, you should buy this because it's priced competitively, or it looks great with your furniture, or everything but you should buy this because it's socially responsible, which is kind of a hindrance, right? In a movement that's pushing social responsibility, we're afraid of polarizing other people. Does that make sense? Like, we're afraid of looking too preachy. And that research is out there with college students, which I didn't know at the time, who are afraid to inject moral issues into college classroom because they don't want to be branded as too liberal or too Republican or too X, Y, or Z. And you also are seeing this in social movements, right? Which is crazy because social movement activists are the people who should be saying, this is what you should do, right? But we're seeing, even though our political rhetoric is so harsh, right? I mean, the way politicians talk to each other, on an everyday basis, we're not seeing that kind of harsh dialogue. Of course, we see it on anonymous blog posts, but that's different. Face-to-face, we're less likely to see that. So those were major issues. I was looking at international travel and showing how that becomes a tipping point for fair trade activism. Any other questions? Well, in the UK, if you ask people, if you show people different fair trade symbols, over 3/4 of the population will recognize what that symbol is and give you some understanding of what it means. In the United States, it's about, I think the last number I saw was about 34% of Americans know what these symbols are and what they mean. So it's a pretty radical difference. The exciting part is it means there's a lot of growth to come. And the other exciting part is we see a skew with younger people knowing what fair trade means more than older people, showing that this, could stick around. Northern Europe is much more aware of what fair trade means than Southern Europe. I don't know why. I'm sure other people in this room could help flesh that out. But we do see much greater awareness in Northern Europe than in the United States. free trade being like just a non-certified. I mean, fair trade is working within free trade, right? They're the same. They're working within the same system, right? We think of them as very different, but fair trade is a social movement that's abiding by the same rules as any other coffee. So the reason I ask is because you get some coffee that's direct traded, and this is a lot of direct trade is really great for farmers. Cuts out a lot of middlemen, provides a lot of extra money, and this is conventional free trade relationships. At the same time, there's a danger sometimes in some of those relationships. So if you're searching the world, there's a show, Donna, what's the show called? La Colombe's founder, Dangerous Grounds. Dangerous Grounds. Some of you may be seen this. He's searching the world for the best, most high-quality coffees. And in doing so, sometimes he provides a premium that's well above fair trade premiums and provides a great economic benefit for local communities. At the same time, some of those same purchases can be dangerous if he's buying, coffee from Haiti one year and from the next year from Colombia and from the next year. So it doesn't provide the assurance that the contracts can be there year in, year out. So yeah, I see fair trade as working within the free market, even though we think of them as different. I didn't provide a quick and dirty fair trade definition. This is the last point, and then I'll leave for the day. In part because it's negotiated, right? We're constantly pushing back into what fair trade means. There are different standards for what fair trade means, if it's grown on a plantation or a cooperative, and these are important. But I think that if we think of fair trade as a movement, we can deal with this differences in standards as to what fair trade means for different products and different organizations even. So thank you. Thank you.